You said that you've been a seeker, a person who tries to make sense of the universe. If you were to put that in a single word, then would you say that you're a futurist, a singularitarian, a science fiction author, a professor and a teacher, a mathematician? Who is Vernor Vinge, in his own words?
Uh, I know people who would rise in rage at the idea of trying to reduce such to one word, since
It's
it's
a
sort of
loaded
like
question.
saying, "Tell me what this Encyclopedia Britannica says in one word."
Absolutely.
There are certain basic notions of bit economy or bit lossy data compression. So having said that, and I wanted to frame that question in my answer with those words. But if you want one word, one thing, I would say the science fiction writer.
Mm-hmm. Science fiction writer. Very interesting. So, since you were the science fiction writer who coined the term, the technological singularity, and that was, I think, 30 some years ago in Marooned in Real Time.
Actually, let me say a little bit, or modify that. Using the term, singularity in the sense that I am using it. The first time I did that was at an artificial intelligence conference at Carnegie Mellon in, just a second,
93?
in 1982.
Oh, 1982, yeah.
And then Omni magazine. There was an editor from Omni. I was on a panel. Actually, it was a panel with Marvin Minsky, and this just popped out when I was talking on the panel. And afterwards, one of the editors at Omni magazine came around and asked me if I would be interested in writing an op-ed piece about that, which I did. And then in the 80s, I wrote these two novels. The Peace War and Marooned in Real Time, and the singularity plays a background role, as you mentioned, in Marooned in Real Time. This all through the 80s. Then, when I'd go to science fiction conventions, I'd talk about this, and people would talk to me about this, and after these books came out, more people would talk to me, and this gave me about 10 years to sort of think about the notion, and also since I was usually talking to technological people, mostly programmers, but there was really a lot of feedback and a lot of pointed questions, and so in a way it worked out ideally, because in the early 90s I was invited to talk at NASA, and I gave a talk about the singularity. But by that time, I'd gotten my act together. I had some nice examples. I had the sort of different paths to the singularity that we may talk about in this interview, but that are in my essay. And this meant that I took the talk that I gave and I made it into a printed essay, and it's on my. If you go to my pages at San Diego State University, you can find that. And that was in 1992 or 1993, and that's actually a very nice essay. And partly because I had 10 years to think about it, I think that essay stands up very well. In fact, if I just get approached casually about this, I just point to that essay, because there's virtually nothing in it that I would seriously disagree with at this point, and I said a lot of things right in there. So that's kind of my history of the way I'm using that term.
It's a very classic essay indeed, and I only read it probably 3 or 4 years ago, and I was very impressed about the fact that it still holds perfectly well in time, and it's perfectly reasonable still, even actually perhaps more powerful than in the 90s, because the awareness, the public awareness of the probability of the singularity as a very high potentiality is much higher, I think, than in the 90s.
Right. I figure that as time goes forward, if some terrible disaster doesn't happen, I mean, if our world continues, that this is just going to become, until it happens, it's going to become kind of a a part of the background wallpaper of modern culture is there is this notion about what this progress means, and probably more and more as time goes on, it fits more with what appears to be going on. And as in that sense, it just becomes sort of a steady drumbeat, background music or background wallpaper to how we look at things when it comes to progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think as time goes by, it's much harder to dismiss than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And I think in another 5 or 10 years ago, it would be even harder to dismiss. So it gets to be...
Even if a person, even if it's not at the center of a particular person's notion of what's going to happen, it still is a way of looking at things. I think it's important when a person looks at the real world to have several. There are things you believe about the real world, but in trying to interpret what's happening from day to day, it's nice to have several different models, several different theories, and when it comes to the singularity, which is what I think in this regard I think about the most, I have these different ways of singularity, different trends toward the singularity, and as I watch events in the real world, pigeonholing them with regard to that model is actually very useful. Now, I also run other models. Another model is singularity is not going to happen. And I actually gave a talk I'm quite proud of about that up at the Long Now a couple of years ago. And if you look for counter indicators, things, there are ways of looking at the world that when you look at it with that particular set of glasses on, you see things that you might not have seen otherwise. So I think it's, even if you don't believe all the theories that you encounter in the real world, it's good to have several of them that you think about carefully and use as filters occasionally to look at what's happening. And you may see things popping out of the background noise that you wouldn't have seen otherwise.
Yeah. And in a way, that says to me that you were successful in your search because you did manage to find, it seems to me successfully, a very powerful idea which kind of really does make sense from the overall direction of things in the universe, I think. Would you say, would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's certainly been helpful to me in the way I look at things myself.
And I mean, the way it's being picked up by a number of people, including myself, and now with Ray Kurzweil's documentaries coming up in the mainstream, and him and Barry Ptolemy kind of having this big public relations tour across the TV networks, radio stations, and so on, the idea comes more and more into the mainstream, I think. So
it's a little bit like imagining what it would be with what it was like in recognizing the Industrial Revolution. Now, in my opinion, the singularity is a much bigger thing than the Industrial Revolution.
Absolutely.
But the Industrial Revolution, as we talk about it nowadays, is spread over 150 years or so. And it would be interesting to kind of look as you progress through that time as an historical study, to watch how commentators, the pace was much slower than it is now, but to watch how commentators, woke up to the notion that something was happening and the sort of jargons that they applied to describe it. And that same sort of realization, I think, is happening here with computation and other things that have to do with thought.
Absolutely. So let me see if we can push that concept even further. You said it took you about 10 years until you managed to get it polished and sort of well formed into your mind, and you published your classic 1993 paper. But have your concept evolved after that, from 1993 till 2011, for example? That's almost 20 years. Has anything changed for the last 20 years?
Well, the answer to that is a little bit embarrassing, because one of my rules of thumb is that if you see somebody who hasn't changed their ideas for 20 years, there's something wrong. So I'm embarrassed because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's very little that I would have to complain about with the NASA essay from '93. So in terms of things that or emphases that are different, I think really there are, and in fact, in the last 2 or 3 years, I have felt some changes, and it's really something that I would expect that as time goes forward. Let's suppose the singularity really is going to happen. As time goes forward, you get a better idea of what's happening, and as I think Charles Stross, the science fiction writer, has pointed out, as you move along toward it, if there is anything like added intelligence for the human race as a whole, which with the internet and with various features that effectively amplify our intelligence, it's quite possible that we will, as we move forward to it, actually have insights that were not possible before. So that go ahead.
That's very interesting here. Let me just jump right in, because I'm also in a sort of email exchange with Charles Stross for an interview, and because I love his book Accelerando, and I think it's one of the best singularity.
Which book?
Accelerando.
Yes, he's actually, Charlie has written all sorts of super books, but that's certainly the premier singularity one that he's written, I think.
I think so too, but the most interesting thing was that in his email, he told me something which quite surprised me, and that was that he is more of a singularity skeptic for the last several years, because he told me, don't forget I wrote that book in 2004, and in the last several years I'm more of a singularity skeptic.
Well, your interview with him should be very interesting.
And I just can't wait to find out why. But that sort of also fits with your interesting statement that people normally should change their ideas in time. And thus you felt a little uncomfortable that you haven't changed your mind on the singularity too much.
Right. I see. I have sort of, given that it's 2011, there's certain things that are going on that would make certain of the trends that I had in the paper seem like they're going better, and other ones may be going worse. So I do have the feeling that it's clear what is going on, but it's not a revolutionary change in the views that I had in the early 90s.
Let me grab this thought then and see what are the markers, what are the indicators that what you had in mind is actually occurring or unfolding as we speak, that we're getting indeed closer towards the singularity, and so do you see those? What are those? And if not, then what would be the negative markers that we're not getting towards a singularity?
Right. Let me mention a background thing, is that IEEE Spectrum had an issue dedicated to singularity in 2008, and they had a lot of essays in it by pro and con points of view, and I highly recommend that. I had the enviable position of getting to write a sort of summary where I was able to talk about everybody else's essay. So it was a lot of fun for me, and I think it was a lot of fun for other people. And one thing I pointed out there, and which I pointed out in the 1993 essay, is these different paths to the singularity, and those are the particular. I watch my symptoms about the singularity relative to each of those. So let me just say roughly what those are. One is the classical artificial intelligence scenario. You make a machine that's very smart, which would include, if it's running a mobile, it would include robots. Then there's intelligence amplification scenario that we use the computers to make ourselves as individuals superhumanly intelligent. And then there's the internet scenario, which is humanity and its networks and the computers and their databases. Altogether, the ensemble is superhumanly intelligent. And then